Psychology 1, Psych V01, Introduction to Psychology and Research Methods. I'm Dr. Oliver Williams. You want to know more about me or meet me, I did a video in the introduction part, so you can see me there as well. I'm not quite sure if the cameo of my face is coming through on this or not. I don't think it is. So we have quite a few slides to get through. In fact, this presentation is going to be split into two separate videos, I believe, simply because of its length. And I'm going to go through this fairly rapidly. You can go back and review the slides. I will have the slides there and ready for you to download, so you can download the slides and watch this video presentation with me as well. Anyway, what is psychology? What is psychology? Under psychology, we think of a psyche. The psyche is the mind. There's another term called logos, and logos is knowledge or study. But psychology itself is both a science and a profession. So what is the definition of psychology? It's the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Overt behavior, in other words, acting out, running, sitting, anything, just being. If you're absolutely still, that's a behavior. Any behavior, second to second, is your behavior. And the mental processes, which include thought, what we call cognition, and affect, which we call emotions. So the three things together at any given time represent you, and that is thought or cognition, behavior or acting, and affect or emotion. At any given second, you are in some proportion or another involved in all three of those. Empiricism, if you've never heard the term before, what is empiricism? It's meant to improve on common sense knowledge using scientific observation rather than casual observation. And the reason for this is we may intuit or have intuition about certain things that may or may not be true, simply because we as humans and our sensory ability make a lot of errors in perceiving things. So scientific observation it yields empirical evidence through direct observation and measurement that's systematic, that is carefully planned, and it's intersubjective. In other words, it's confirmable by more than one observer. You do an experiment, something, you make an observation, you call in a cohort, you say, hey, I see that, do you see that too? And they say, yeah, I see that too. Then it becomes intersubjective. Everyone agrees that that's what we see. The research method itself, and the research method applies to both physical and social sciences. So in fact, if you are moving to get some sort of a degree in either the physical or social sciences, you will take a course, or maybe more than one course, in research methods. So the course that you take in research methods, and we're going to go through this briefly here first, is a systematic procedure for answering scientific questions. So we start with a question. We go to the literature, not Google, but to a research database, like in psychology or sociology or economics or physics or whatever. You go and you do a research, and you research the literature review to see what has been done or what they know about the question you have. So you do this theoretical research, then you do a descriptive research. You find the theory and you state your questions in terms of hypotheses, and then you do an empirical study in order to demonstrate one way or the other whether your question and whether your statement of whether something or not works does indeed work. So the goals of psychology, and psychology in general now, not psychology like as a therapy, but just in general, being able to name and classify various observable, measurable behaviors, understanding and being able to state the causes of behavior, being able to predict or forecast behavior, and control, being able to alter the conditions that influence behavior. What is critical thinking? Critical thinking, not critical thinking like you think wrong, like criticizing your thinking, but critical thinking. It is a type of reflection involving asking yourself if a belief, some belief you have by scientific theory or a belief you have personally, does that actually meet systematic observation? If you tested that belief scientifically, would it really hold out to be true? Critical thinking. Thinkers are always willing to challenge conventional wisdom. And this is what we use in research. Some of the basic principles of critical thinking include few truths transcend the need for logical analysis. Critical thinkers often wonder what it would take to show what a truth is false. Or in other words, if it is absolutely true, find a condition where it's false. And if in fact one can find that it's false in another condition, then it isn't absolutely true. Authority or claimed expertise does not automatically make an idea true or false. Authority does not make an idea true or false. Judging the quality of evidence is very crucial. Or in other words, whether you get information from some shady YouTube channel or a website versus whether you get your evidence from an established database at an academic institution. So the quality of the evidence is very crucial. And then last, but actually probably most important, it requires an open mind so that whatever the information is that you do discover, if in fact what you discover challenges and very seriously challenges a previously held belief, you need to have an open mind and accept that. Pseudo or pseudopsychologies or pseudoscience means false. It's any unfounded system that resembles psychology or resembles science, but it's not based on scientific testing. It just looks like it's scientific. And the people who try to promote it try to make it look like it's scientific. So pseudopsychologies are types of superstitions. Let's name a few. Phrenology is one pseudopsychology is called phrenology, and it claims that it can reveal personality traits by the shape of your skull and reading the bumps on your head. Palmistry, I think everyone knows what palmistry is. Lines on your hands predict future and reveal personality. Graphology's personality traits are revealed by your handwriting. And last but certainly not least, astrology, that the positions of the stars and the planets at your birth can determine personality traits and affect your behavior. Why does astrology survive? Remember, this was a system, a thing that was set up 2 millennia ago, during a time when people believed that the Earth was the center of the universe, when they had no idea how stars were, when they made patterns in the sky with stars like the Big Dipper or Orion or stuff like that, and had no idea that those stars were thousands of light years away from one another, or maybe it wasn't even a star. Maybe what they're actually looking at is a galaxy. So again, let's consider this. Why does astrology survive? Uncritical acceptance. It's a tendency to believe positive or flattering descriptions of yourself, which is almost every day on these zodiacs. Also, confirmation bias. It's a tendency to notice and remember information that confirms your beliefs and expectations and ignore the contradictions and discrepancies. Then there's the Barnum effect, and that is a tendency to consider personal descriptions accurate if stated in general terms. So always have a little something for everyone. Make sure all palm readings, horoscopes are so general that something in them will always apply to any one person. And so in that case, as you're doing that, somebody say, oh yeah, that's right, hey, that's me. The scientific method is a form of critical thinking based on careful collection of evidence, accurate description and measurement, precise definition, controlled observation, and repeated results. Think of yourself in chemistry class, in high school chemistry class, where every single step you're measuring and taking notes. That is what we're doing. We have an observation, a question, we research, then we have an hypothesis. We state something. If I do this, will that happen? Then we do the experiment, collect the data, analyze the data, and come to a conclusion. Beyond that, then, if that conclusion and the experiment itself provides some worth to the scientific community in which you're involved, psychology, sociology, physics, whatever it is, you then also want to publish that paper, your experiment. So the scientific method has six very essential elements. We make observations, we design a problem, we propose a hypothesis, we gather evidence and data, we build the theory, and we publish the results. What is a hypothesis? It is a scientifically testable predicted outcome of an experiment or educated guess about the relationship between variables. An operational definition is one that defines a scientific concept by stating specific actions or procedures used to measure it. So, for example, if I said I want to measure parental warmth. Now, I think we all know what parental warmth is. However, if you wanted to go out and measure it and actually find high, medium, and low parental warmth, think about it. You have to operationalize that. You have to set standards by which you're going to measure it, what observations are you going to make, what is it that you're looking for when there is parental warmth. And then those statements or items have to be stated in such a way that they are precise and valid and simple. When we build a theory, look, if I say, hey, I have a theory it's going to rain tomorrow, that's not a theory. That's a guess. That's a hunch. A theory is a body of evidence with hundreds, thousands of databases or experiments that have gone to different types of experiments that validate the same experiment with the same theory. With a theory, one can predict. And so from theories, we come up with hypotheses. And then you say, well, if I do this experiment, will the theory hold up? Because the theory predicts that if I drop something from 3 feet, it would have a velocity of whatever. And so I drop it from 3 feet, and indeed, at the bottom, I measure the velocity and the speed of it, and indeed, it has whatever velocity it predicted to have. So at that particular case, gravity works in that case. Now, if I take that same object and drop it from 3 feet, and I am on the moon, and I predict that it's going to have the same velocity as when I dropped it from Earth, then there's going to be an error because I haven't taken into account general gravity, not just the gravity of Earth, but then at the moon. Moon has gravity, but much less. In fact, it's 1/6 of the Earth, which is why you can jump real high. So a theory encompasses all that there is until you can disconfirm it. You can falsify it, in which case we don't throw the theory out, we expand it so that more operates under it. The so-called father of psychology, the very beginnings of it, was a guy named, and I'll say that you'll say Wilhelm Wundt, but actually the German pronunciation of his name is Wilhelm Wundt. And he's the father of psychology. In 1879, he set up the first lab to study what he called conscious experience. Conscious experience. Now, what that is, I don't know, and I'd like to ask him, but I can't. But he specifically was interested in introspection, looking inward and examining and reporting thoughts and feelings and so on. Now, Wundt's ideas were brought to the United States by Edward Titchener, and he renamed it structuralism because he wanted to have give more structure to the idea of mental life. And we still really don't know what mental life is at this point. So the structuralists often disagreed. There was no way to use introspection to determine who was correct. You can't, because you can't have multiple observations of the same event. You don't know what's going on in my mind. I don't know what's going on in yours. William James then came along, an American, and came up with what he called functionalism. And that is, mental structure, he said, is less important than mental function. So functionalists admire Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. Animals keep physical features through evolution that help them adapt to environments. So how the mind functions may also help us adapt and survive, and indeed it does. Educational psychology was promoted by functionalists as a discipline that studies mental adaptation and the study of learning, teaching, classroom dynamics, related topics, and so on, sprung out of educational psychology. Behaviorism, which is another branch of psychology, started with John Watson, and then Ivan Pavlov. You've heard of Pavlov's dog, and then B.F. Skinner. Now, these were all behaviorists, and in that they said that psychology must observe only observable behavior, and that's the only thing that counts, is what they thought. So they studied the relationship between stimuli and environmental events. Stimuli and environmental events. So responses, any identifiable behavior. So if you snap a rubber band on your wrist and you wince a little bit, now that's an observable behavior. Snap of the rubber band, a little pain on your wrist, and then a little wince. Those two go together. So and there's an immense amount of information there, and we still use behaviorism, but it isn't the only way. All of these things melt together. As I said in an earlier one, we have a theory, then we find that something contradicts the theory. So what we do is we expand the theory. In this case, we're talking about the theory of learning, in which case we have behaviorism. And under behaviorism, we have both Ivan Pavlov's form of behaviorism, which we call classical conditioning, and then B.F. Skinner's form of behaviorism, which we call operant conditioning, and then later also we'll talk to somebody or learn about somebody whose name is Albert Bandura, and that's social cognition, all forms of behaviorism. Watson, however, now studied classical conditioning, and that was discovered by Pavlov. Again, I think probably you've heard of Pavlov's dog. Skinner studied operant conditioning, and although Skinner studied animals, he believed humans learned the same way. Now, cognitive behaviorism came about with this idea. Thought is behavior in and of itself. We simply don't see it with our eyes, but it exists. It's behavior. It's neurons in action. They are behaving. There's motion going on there. So radical behaviorism dealt with mental events such as thinking, and they said it's not necessary to explain behavior. You don't need to think about thinking. It's just all you have to do is see the result of the thinking, just events, just physical events. Cognitive behaviorism went on to say, together, cognition and conditioning better explain behavior, and that is very true. So our thoughts influence our behaviors, and our behaviors influence our thoughts. So this is used often in the treatment of depression and anxiety and other disorders, where we try to alter our patients, our clients' behavior, because the altered behavior also feeds back into thought and into feeling. It's a circle. There's another kind of psychology. It was called Gestalt psychology. And Gestalt psychology said the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Or in other words, the whole that comes about from a combination of cognition, affect, and acting or behavior, that put together creates a synergy, which in and of itself creates yet one something that is even more whole. Now, Max Wertheimer is how you pronounce that in German. We'd say Max Wertheimer. Studied thinking, learning, and perception in whole units, not by analyzing experiences into parts. And so, in this, when you look at these somewhat contradictory images that I have on the screen, you see here, you can see a man. There's his nose right there, and he's playing the saxophone. Or you could see the silhouette of a female face right there. There's her lips, eyes, part of her nose. So this is a whole image, and depending upon how you look at it, you could see one of two things. This is a goblet right here, but these are also two faces facing one another. Here is, you can see it's a fork. There's also little wine bottles in there. And the idea behind all of this is that figure and ground, which is one of the earliest things we learn as infants growing up. One of the first things we learn is the difference between figure and ground. He goes back, Max Wertheimer and the entire Gestalt psychology goes back and looks at how anybody makes a determination of figure ground, because you can turn those images. What is that? It's just a process of changing figure ground, figure ground, figure ground. And then, of course, I'm sure you've all heard of Sigmund Freud. Now, Sigmund Freud started what we call psychoanalysis and the psychoanalytic perspective. Sigmund Freud believed that behavior is largely influenced by unconscious wishes, thoughts, and sex, especially sex and aggression. He particularly believed that sex and aggression and violence were part of this unconscious, subconscious drive, which he called the id. He said that there was a process called repression, which occurs when threatening thoughts are unconsciously held out of awareness. And he created, as I said, psychoanalysis, and this was the first psychotherapy. This is the first counseling session by Sigmund Freud, and to explore unconscious conflicts and emotional problems. After Freud, some of Freud's students eventually broke away from him to promote their own new Freudian theories. Some of them were Alfred Adler, Karen Horney, and Carl Jung. So these were some of the neo-Freudians, the psychologists, that took some of the premises from Freud and they built upon them or changed them a little bit. By the way, Freud did not like that. He didn't like his theories messed with, but these people messed with them, and he messed with them in a good way. Another form of psychology, it still hangs on, but is called humanism. Now, the goal of humanism is to study the unique aspects of any given individual. And so it focuses on human experience, potentials, ideals, problems. Mind you, now, as I say these words, think to yourself, think critically. How would I research any of these particular things? And as you think about, like, how would I research potentials? So as you move down through that, these broad experiences encompass many little details. Each person has a unique goodness and is able to use free will in contrast with determinism, which is what Skinner and Freud believed. The key names in humanism, in humanistic psychology, are Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. What are some of the key concepts that we take away from humanism? Well, self-image, your perception of your own body, personality, and capabilities. Self-evaluation, your frame of reference, your mental perspective, and, according to Abraham Maslow, something he called self-actualization, and that is fully developing one's potential and becoming the best person possible. Okay, I'm not quite sure how to research that either. By the way, none of these early psychologists, none of them were into research. They simply believed what they observed, and that was it. So, and what they observed and what they believed were in small areas of any given particular culture. They started out mostly in Europe, in Austria, in Germany, in England. So the time and the culture themselves will indeed bias some of the ideas. So how do you come up with an idea about a human if you're not getting enough sample of enough humans? So the frame of reference and mental perspective used for interpreting events, again, depends upon who you are and where you are. It's a context issue. Now, early psychology, I'm glad to say, did start to have some diversity. Some of the most early psychologists were Caucasian men, but there were women and ethnic minority pioneers. Margaret Washburn was the first woman awarded a PhD in psychology in 1894. Francis Cecil Sumner was the first African American man awarded a PhD in psychology in 1920. And Inez Beverly Prosser was the first African American woman awarded a PhD in psychology in 1933. So today in psychology, we have three broad views. We have a biopsychological view, a psychological view, and a sociocultural view. And they all offer complementary perspectives on behavior. We can't dismiss any of them. We need to include all of them. Most psychologists are what we consider to be eclectic, drawing insights from a variety of different perspectives and ways of doing things, because a single perspective is unlikely to explain all of human behavior. It used to be 50, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, to go get a PhD or an MD in psychology. You get a PhD in psychology or an MD in psychiatry. But either way, you would be asked, well, what's your theoretical orientation? And then from then on in, you might say, well, I'm a Freudian, I'm a psychoanalyst. Then everything you see you'd try to explain relative to that particular orientation or that particular theory. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. And I'll say now what I say to many students, especially my graduate students who are learning to be psychotherapists, and that is, if your only tool is a hammer, then all you'll see are nails. There are many tools, and we use them wisely, and we use them with intelligence and experience. So in the biopsychological view, behavior is shaped by internal, physical, chemical, and biological processes. So under biopsychology, we also find neuroscience, which is an interdisciplinary field formed by biologists and biopsychologists and other scientists who share this perspective in biopsychology. The evolutionary view is that behavior is shaped by the process of evolution. That is, behavior, acting, learning, cognition, affect, emotion. Everything comes from the very beginning, from the single-celled organisms that after millions and millions, billions of years, here we are. So today, the psychological perspective is, among these things, the behavioral view. It's shaped by the environment. The cognitive view, it's shaped by mental processes. The psychodynamic view, and that is shaped by unconscious processes. And the humanistic view, behavior is shaped by self-image, subjective perception, and the needs for personal growth. Then we also have the socio-cultural view, in that behavior is shaped by one's social and cultural context. Let's talk about that. Because of cultural relativity, and cultures are different, obviously, I'm glad they are, A behavior has to be judged relative to the values and social norms of the culture in which it occurs, in which you observe it. Social norms are rules that define acceptable expected behavior for members of different groups within different cultures. So psychologists, we need to be aware of the impact cultural diversity may have on our behaviors. Not everybody follows the same rules. There are different kinds of psychologists, many flavors of psychologists, but psychologists usually have a master's or doctorate degree. I myself am a psychologist, a clinical psychologist with a degree in clinical psychology from University of California at Santa Barbara. We're trained in methods and knowledge and theories in psychology. Clinical psychologists treat more severe psychological problems and do research on mental disorders. I myself worked and interned at what is no longer Camarillo State Mental Hospital. It got turned into California State University at Channel Islands. But I worked there for 2.5 years, mostly working with people with schizophrenia. Counseling psychologists treat milder problems like school and work problems, but not all psychologists perform therapy. So what might a psychologist research? Development, the course of human growth, and I mean lifespan, from womb to tomb. Learning, how do we learn? How do we forget? That's part of learning. Personality, what is that? And what is it in its many forms? And sensation and perception, how we come to know the world through our 5 senses. We do comparative studies, and we study and compare behavior of different species or different animals or different cultures. We study cognition and interested in thinking, memory, forgetting, biopsychology, gender, study differences between males and females and how they develop, and human and social behavior and interaction. We study how culture affects behavior and vice versa. And evolutionary psychology, how our behavior is guided by patterns that evolved during our history. Psychologists study the behavior of all organisms, and it is amazing how similar organisms are to us in some way. And it becomes very clear that we are part of one long stream of DNA. When we study the so-called animal model, it's the animals' behaviors used to derive principles that may apply to human behavior. Animal research also it can benefit animals directly, like if it's used and it benefits conservation efforts and things like that. So what other types of mental health professionals are there on top of psychologists? The psychiatrist has an MD here. So he or she is like a psychologist, but is an MD. And most psychiatrists do prescriptions and deal with prescriptions and more serious mental illness, people in hospitals and restricted settings and that sort of thing. The psychoanalyst received training as a during his her post PhD. It's called a postdoc or MD. The counselor is usually a person with a master's degree, helps solve problems, marriage, school, so on. And a psychiatric social worker or an MSW is a person with a master's degree in social work. And they apply social science principles to help people in clinics and hospitals and also in neighborhoods. A lot of MSWs are also, they work for child protection services and things like that as well. So what is an experiment? An experiment to identify and cause and effect relationships. If A interacts with B, what happens? So in some way, we directly vary a condition you might think affects behavior. Then we create two or more groups of subjects alike in all ways except the condition you're varying. And then we record whether varying the condition has any effect on the behavior. Subjects and variables. Some of the most important things in any experiment. You've got to have subjects and you've got to have variables. Subjects can be animals or people. They're also called, and preferably called, participants. And it's that behavior that we investigate. And the variables are those conditions that can change and might affect an experiment's outcome. But the variables could also just be constants. Constant variable might be the sex of the individuals or the ages or things, their levels of education, things like that. There are three types of variables. There's the independent variable, and that is the condition that we altered by the experimenter. I'll give things that you change. You can change that. You've got control of that. You change that and then observe the dependent variable change relative to how you change the independent variable. I'll give you an example. If your foot is on your gas pedal, the distance of your foot or the pedal from the floor of the car indicates you would, as you push down on that and that distance decreases from the floor, what changes? Your speed, the speedometer dial starts going up. So the speedometer dial or your speed is the dependent variable. How far you push that gas pedal, that's the independent variable. Extraneous variables are conditions that the researcher wants to prevent from affecting the outcome of the experiment. Say, for example, in our experiment of speed and how far you press your gas pedal, well, one extraneous condition might be you get a ticket. So you have to be in a condition where you could experiment with the entire distance of your gas from the gas pedal from the floor all the way down to zero to see what the effects are. Now, an experimental versus a control group. An experimental group is the group of participants used to the independent variable, and the control group is the group of participants exposed to all the variables that the experimental group is exposed to except the independent variable. Now, drug companies do this all the time. So they'll give one, let's say they're doing a study on depression. They'll give one group of people a placebo. It's a placebo. A placebo is just a pill that looks like the real pill, but it isn't. It's just filled with sugar or something. And then the other pill that is supposedly the antidepressant. And then after 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, they'll do you do another test for depression for both the control group and the experimental group. And we see that if the levels of depression in the experimental group went down, and in the control group it didn't go down or didn't go down hardly very much, we'd say that the experiment worked. But we have to have something to compare it to. We can't just say, hey, this works, take it. And the FDA certainly is going to buy that. It is very important when we do experiments that we stick with random assignments, and in that, what does random assignment mean? That means that every participant has an equal chance of being either the experimental or the control group. So if I want to do an experiment and I've got a room of 30 students wanting to participate in my experiment, I can't just point at them and say, hey, you go. No, that itself would be biasing the experiment. I would have to make some sort of a lottery system, or just if there's 30 in there and put 1 through 30 and fold them over and just pass them out. And whoever gets the number that they haven't seen, they open it up and that's it. That is the only way that we can randomly and without bias assign participants to groups. And once we do our experiment, we are looking for something statistically, and we're not going into any statistics here, but The difference must be large enough so that it would occur by chance in less than 5 experiments out of 100. In other words, let's suppose I find that my experiment really works. It's great. If I did that same experiment 100 times, I would then the results that I find uh, uh, could only occur 5 times by chance. And we like to see even more significance, or any like only once out of 1,000 times by chance, and so on. Meta-analysis is a study of the results of many other studies. So we discuss research participant bias, and this is behavior caused by the influence of their expectations, of which we all have. So, like I mentioned, a placebo, like a fake sugar pill or saline injection, but that's a placebo effect. It changes our behavior. If I had you all in a room right now, and let's say 10 of you had a headache, and you've got about the same level of headache, and I gave 5 of you real ibuprofen, and I gave 5 of you pills that looked ibuprofen, but they're just sugar pills, and then waited for an hour, the ones with the sugar pills might have a decrease in headache, but you'd still have a headache. And the ones that took the ibuprofen would have much less of a headache. The reason the sugar pills, the placebo, is because your brain, your mind operates on you. It's your expectation. So if a placebo has any effect at all, it's just based on suggestion, not chemistry. We have what's also 2 kinds of experiments. We have a blind and a double-blind experiment. So in a blind experiment, participants have no idea whether they're getting the real treatment or placebo, like just what we did. You don't know. A double-blind experiment would be, I wouldn't know which one I'm giving you either. So the researchers also have bias, and we try to follow. I mean, unconsciously don't really want to, this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that a prediction leads to people acting in some way to make the prediction come true, and that has to be removed for a true experiment. So in many times we do again this double blind to remove both the experimenter and the participants out of any kind of expectancy. Then we have what are called naturalistic observations. And these are observing behavior in a natural setting, in an environment in which the observed person or animal lives. So on the left there, you see Jane Goodall, and the right, individuals, it looks like they're in a group therapy session, and it appears as if some students are observing that group therapy session in progress. But again, this is observing behavior in a natural setting, not in an office one-on-one. Now, the observer effect can change a subject's behavior as well, and it's just caused by being observed. So even observer bias, when we see it, expect so when we're looking at something, we only remember certain or selected details. The other thing we get into is something called the anthropomorphic fallacy. That may be a mouthful. Anthropomorphic fallacy. Many people do this. I'm going to repeat it. The anthropomorphic fallacy, attributing human thoughts, feelings, or motives to animals, especially as a way of explaining their behavior. Like, Anya, my cat, is acting lethargic because she's feeling depressed today. That is an anthropomorphic fallacy. We also do correlational studies, and these are studies designed to measure the degree of a relationship, if any, between 2 or more events, measures, or variables. So a predictor variable might be senior high school grades, and they used to predict freshman college grades. And The cartoon here sees everybody who went to the moon has eaten chicken. And then he says, good grief, chicken makes you go to the moon. That's just a false uh, condition, a false conclusion. I could tell you, and I have proof. I could show you the data demonstrating that the more ice cream that is consumed, the more drownings occur. More ice cream occurs, the more that is consumed, the more drownings occur, and one might come to the conclusion that ice cream causes drowning. And that's absolutely not true. Again, here's the problem with correlation. Yes, you can show that there is a correlation between drownings and ice cream consumption. But when is ice cream consumed? In the summer, usually, or warmer months. And what do people also do in the warmer months? They go in the water. So it isn't ice cream causing the problem. It's the season of the year. We look at different kinds of what are called correlations. What we're looking at there is a very strong correlation. It's a positive correlation that shows a relationship between recent life stress score and a depression score. And you can see that most of those points they're not exactly on that line, but very, very, very close to it. And that would give something, that correlation, something like maybe a 0.95. Remember that a correlation here, you see up here on the screen, the correlation can never be greater than 1 or never less than -1. But the closer to 1 it is, or -1, the stronger the correlation. This represents a very, very strong correlation right here, because most of these points are on that straight line. A positive correlation increases in one variable matched by increases in the other variables. So that's a positive correlation here. As recent life stress scores, as that increases, we also see an increase in the depression score. Negative correlation increases in one variable are matched by decreases in the other. So in fact, if this line went that way, we would see decreases in depression score and an increase in life stress score. And that wouldn't make much sense, but that would go in the other direction. They'd have a negative slope. But a correlation that doesn't demonstrate any cause, and remember this, correlation does not mean causation. Just because two variables are related does not mean that one variable causes the other to occur. And this, in fact, is how many superstitions began, probably a long, long time ago, and they were just reinforced by others. We have what's called the clinical method of study, in which we look at case studies. So this is how Freud worked. Freud had many in-depth cases that he studied. So he didn't follow the scientific method of research at all. He simply used case studies, many of them. We have natural clinical tests, natural events like accidents that provide psychological data as well. We have a survey method. So we can send surveys, and many of my students use the survey method for their research and writing their dissertations. They send out a survey on a link, and people respond accordingly. But remember, this is just one data point. So when somebody answers all of the questions, they don't have a before after. This is just doing a cross section. And sampling is a representative sample. It's a small group that accurately reflects a larger population. And we have to be very careful with that in how we define the population first in order to select the representative sample. But a population is an entire group of anything. It can be animals or people or rocks or whatever, but it's the population of everything. When we do internet surveys or web-based processes, like I said earlier, it's low cost. We can reach many, many people. When you include those in your surveys to do research, You have to also make certain that you have questions in there that will catch bots or just people fooling around and want to mess with you. So here, for example, we're going to talk about social desirability in survey research. One is called courtesy bias. In research, a tendency to give polite or socially desirable answers. So people want to give people want to be liked. And so people will tend to pick an answer that seems to be more socially desirable, although they may actually believe the other answer. When you listen to anything in the media, this is talking about psychology in the media, I'm talking about anything. You need to think critical and separate fact from fiction. And sometimes that's hard to do because they've wound it together so tightly. But believe me, there's a lot of fiction there. When you listen to that, be skeptical. Consider the source of the information. Beware of oversimplifications. Remember, and then they say, for example, and then tell you something. That's not proof of anything. Ask yourself, was there a control group? Look for errors in distinguishing between correlation and causation, and be sure to distinguish between observation